She stepped off that stagecoach with nothing but a single trunk and a look in her eyes that said she'd survived worse than West Texas. Wade Mercer had ordered a bride the same way a man orders a plow. Practical, necessary, no sentiment attached. He wanted quiet. He wanted simple. He got Eliza Hartwell. And Eliza Hartwell was neither of those things. What he didn't know, what she'd gone to dangerous lengths to hide, was that the woman standing in the dust of his failing ranch was worth more money than he'd ever see in 10 lifetimes. If you're watching this story to the end, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The stagecoach was 40 minutes late, which meant Wade Mercer had been standing in the sun outside the Dry Creek post office for 40 minutes longer than he'd intended, sweating through his shirt collar and regretting every decision that had led him to this particular Tuesday. It was July of 1879, and West Texas in July was the kind of heat that made a man question his own reasoning. The dirt main street of Harlan's Crossing shimmered at the edges. Two dogs had given up on movement entirely and lay flat in the thin shade beside the livery. The blacksmith, Hector Reyes, paused his hammer long enough to glance at Wade standing there alone at the post office steps, then looked away with the particular tact of a man who knew not to ask questions. Wade was 41 years old and looked it, big through the shoulders, with the kind of hands that told a story of hard labor without needing to say a word. His face had been weathered into angles, jaw sharp, eyes the flat gray of overcast sky, and the few lines around his mouth were the kind left by years of not smiling, rather than years of smiling too much. He had a ranch 12 miles east of town called the Double M, which was modest by some standards and barely surviving by his. He had a quarter section of decent grazing land, 2 hired hands who worked for almost nothing because he couldn't afford more, a herd that had thinned through 2 bad winters, and a house that had been too quiet for going on 4 years now. His first wife, Clara, had died of fever in the spring of 1875. That was all he told people. He'd never elaborated, and nobody in Harlan's Crossing had pressed him, because the grief on the man was not the quiet, grievable kind. It was the kind that had calcified, the kind that had settled into the bones and become something other than sadness, a blankness, a removal, an absence of expectation about what tomorrow might hold. The mail order arrangement had been his neighbor Tom Briggs's idea, offered one evening over a shared bottle of rye whiskey when Tom had apparently decided that Wade's solitude had tipped from appropriate mourning into something more dangerous. "You need someone," Tom had said, "not for, just for the practical of it. The house needs running. You're stretched too thin to cook and work the land both. It ain't weakness to admit that." Wade had pushed back on it for 3 months before the third hard winter made up his mind. He'd written to an agency in St. Louis. His letter had been brief to the point of being almost rude. He'd asked specifically for a woman who had no family expecting her back, no obligations elsewhere, and no expectations of romance. He wanted a household partner, a practical arrangement. He'd said as much in writing, which the agency had apparently chosen to overlook. They had written back with Eliza Hartwell's name and a short summary. 24 years old, orphaned young, raised in a household of modest means, educated, capable of cooking, mending, basic accounting. No family, no complications, no complications. That was the part that had closed the deal. He heard the stagecoach before he saw it, the rattle and thud of the wheels on the rutted road from Abilene, the labored breathing of 4 horses that had been pushed in the heat. It swung around the corner of the feed store and pulled up hard in front of the post office, and the driver, a thin man named Gareth with a permanent squint, climbed down and began unloading a single trunk from the roof rack. One trunk. The door opened and Eliza Hartwell stepped down. She was not what he'd pictured. He hadn't pictured much, in honesty, the same way a man ordering a plow doesn't picture the plow. But whatever vague sketch his mind had assembled was not this. She was not small and worn-looking. She was not visibly nervous. She stood on the bottom step of the stagecoach, took one measured look at Harlan's Crossing, at the 2 dead-looking dogs, the dust, the low buildings, the open land stretching flat in every direction, and something passed over her face. Not disappointment, not shock. Something closer to consideration, like she was doing arithmetic. Then she stepped the rest of the way down, brushed a single streak of road dust from her sleeve, and looked directly at him. "Mr. Mercer," she said. Not a question. Miss Hartwell. He came forward to take her trunk. She was medium height, with dark hair pinned back neatly beneath a plain traveling hat that had seen some weather. Her dress was a sensible gray-green, not fashionable, but well-made. Her face was... it was a serious face. The eyes, particularly. Brown, and direct in a way that most women weren't, in his experience. She wasn't looking at him with anxiety or performance. She was just looking at him, steady, like she was deciding something. "You're alone," she observed, glancing around for anyone else. "I am." "No introduction party." "I'm not a party man." Something at the corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile. "Good," she said. "I'm not either." He loaded her trunk into the back of the wagon without another word, and she climbed up to the bench without asking for a hand, which he noticed. They left Harlan's Crossing headed east, and for the first several miles neither of them spoke. It wasn't uncomfortable silence, exactly. It was more like two people who had been in enough uncomfortable situations to know that silence itself wasn't the problem. "Your letter mentioned the ranch is 12 miles out," she said eventually. "About that." "What's the land like?" "Dry, flat, some grass in the low ground, less on the ridge. Good for cattle if you manage it right." He paused. "I haven't always managed it right." She didn't react to that with sympathy or reassurance. She just nodded, like she'd filed it away. "How many head?" she asked. He glanced sideways at her. 83, last count, down from 120. "What took them down?" "2 bad winters, fence breaks I didn't catch fast enough, feed shortage in 77. "Any debt against the land?" He said nothing for a moment. The question was direct enough to be almost offensive, and it clearly surprised her that she'd asked it, because he saw a very slight adjustment in her expression. Not apology exactly, but awareness. "Sorry," she said. "That's forward." "It is." He kept his eyes on the road. "But accurate. There's a note with the bank in Abilene, 3 years' worth of bad returns." She nodded again, looking ahead. "I'm not here to judge the state of it," she said quietly. "I just prefer to know what I'm coming into." He didn't say anything, but something in him, some small locked thing, eased slightly. He wasn't sure why. He'd expected a woman who'd want to be reassured, who'd need the situation softened for her. That was what women expected, he thought, or what he'd assumed. Claire had never asked about the banknote. It had never come up, because she'd had the grace not to ask, and he'd had the pride not to tell her, and they'd managed on that unspoken arrangement. This woman had just asked him point blank inside the first hour. The double M came into view as the road curved past a dry creek bed and a stand of scrub cedar. It wasn't impressive. He'd stopped seeing it the way a stranger might, but he made himself look at it now. The main house, timber frame, low-slung roof, front porch that sagged on the left end where a support post had given. The barn was sound. The bunkhouse where his 2 hands, Pete Gallegos and younger Tommy Strand, lived was smaller than it should have been. The fencing along the near pasture needed attention in 2 places that he could see from the road. He watched her take it in. She didn't say anything. They stopped at the front of the house and he brought her trunk inside, setting it in the main bedroom. He'd moved his own things to the smaller back room without much thought about whether that was the right decision. The house smelled like dust and cooked meat and leather. The kitchen was functional and not much else. The curtains on the front window were the ones Clara had hung and had been washed so many times they'd gone thin in patches. "I'll leave you to settle," he said, standing in the doorway. "Supper's your call, whatever's in the larder. I'll be in the barn." She was standing in the center of the room, looking around with that same accounting expression, and she turned when he spoke. "Mr. Mercer." "Thank you for being honest about the ranch. On the road." He looked at her for a moment. The late afternoon light came through the window and caught the edge of her hair, and there was something about her standing there in that ordinary, faded room that was incongruous, like she was too present for it, too real. "You'll find I'm not much for anything else," he said, and left. She had supper ready by the time he came in, which he hadn't expected: cornbread, beans with salt pork, and a tin of preserved peaches she'd apparently found at the back of the larder. She set it on the table and sat down across from him without ceremony, which was another thing he hadn't expected. "You don't have to eat with me," he said, before he'd thought about how it sounded. She looked at him flatly. "Where would you prefer I eat?" "I meant, I don't..." Most women prefer the kitchen. I prefer the table, she said, with the rest of the household. He didn't argue. Pete and Tommy ate in the bunkhouse, which they always had. So it was just the two of them, and the food was plain and good. And he ate more than he had in weeks, which he didn't comment on and she didn't notice. Or if she noticed, she didn't say. You said you were educated, he said after a few minutes. I read and write well. I can do household accounts, basic ledger work. I taught primary school for 1 term in Illinois. You left? A pause that was short but not nothing. The position ended. He let that alone. Why Texas? He asked instead. She looked at him, and for a moment something moved behind her eyes that wasn't the steady accounting look. Something more private. I wanted to be somewhere no one already had a picture of me, she said. That was an odd way to put it. He thought about it later, after the dishes were done and she'd retired and he was sitting on the porch with what was left of his coffee going cold in his hand. Somewhere no one already had a picture of me. He knew what that felt like. After Clara died, everyone in Harlan's Crossing had had a picture of him. The widower, the struggling rancher, the quiet man who didn't take dinner invitations anymore. It was exhausting being someone else's picture of you. He'd understood that, even if he'd never had the words for it. He sat on the porch until the dark was complete and the coyotes started up somewhere east of the creek, and then he went inside and went to bed. The first week established patterns. She was up before him, which surprised him the first morning and became unremarkable by the third. She had opinions about the kitchen organization that she implemented without asking, and which he had no energy to object to and wouldn't have objected to anyway. She found the household ledger, a battered notebook he kept in a drawer and hadn't opened in 4 months, and spent an evening at the kitchen table with it, working through the numbers in silence while he sat on the other end of the table mending a piece of harness. He tried not to watch her while she worked. He failed somewhat. There was something about the way she moved through tasks. Not quickly, but without waste. Like someone who'd learned early that effort was a resource that had to be budgeted. On the 4th day, she came out to the barn while he and Pete were repairing the south fence sections. I'd like to understand the herd management, she said. Pete, who was holding the fence post, looked at her and then at Wade with an expression of studied neutrality. Why? Wade said. Because I'd like to understand it, she said, patient but not particularly apologetic about the repetition. He showed her. He didn't explain everything, just pointed out the grazing rotation, the water access, where the 2 weak points in the fence run were that he hadn't gotten to yet. She asked one question about the water trough at the north pasture corner that was so specific it made him stop and look at her. Where'd you learn to ask a question like that? He said. I grew up around working land, she said. Different land, but working. He didn't ask more. She hadn't asked more about Clara, and he extended the same to her. The letters started the 2nd week. He noticed them the way a man notices a change in weather, without meaning to, and with a vague unease he couldn't quite name. Letters addressed to E. Hartwell, arriving at the Harlan's Crossing post office. He knew because he picked up the mail on Tuesdays, which was his pattern, and the postmaster, an elderly man named Caldwell, who'd been reading other people's postmarks for 30 years, mentioned it with the studied casualness of a man who was in fact very interested. Letter here for your... Caldwell paused, selecting his word. For Miss Hartwell. Come from an address in Philadelphia. Wade took it home and set it on the kitchen table without a word. She was there when he came in. She saw the letter and something happened to her face. A quick, controlled tightening, gone almost before it was there. And she picked it up and put it in her apron pocket without opening it. Thank you, she said. He went to wash up. When he came back, the letter was not on the table, not anywhere in the kitchen. When he passed her room later, the door was slightly ajar, and he heard the faint rustle of paper being folded. He didn't ask. It wasn't his business. The arrangement they'd come to wasn't one of full disclosure. He hadn't told her everything either, and he knew it. But something in the back of his mind began to take note. A small, cautious thing. There was a second letter the following Tuesday. Different handwriting on the envelope. This one from New York. He brought it home the same way. Set it on the table. She took it the same way. By the third letter, from Boston, 2 weeks later, he had stopped watching her face when she took them because he didn't know what to do with what he saw there. On a Wednesday in mid-August, the ranch had one of those minor disasters that were actually serious if you thought too hard about them. A section of the north fence came down in the night. A post had been weaker than he'd thought, and 2 cattle had gone through. By morning, 11 head were loose on the open land east of the creek, and it was Wade and Pete out at first light trying to drive them back, with Tommy holding the repaired fence sections in place from the south end. It took 4 hours in 100-degree heat. By the time the last steer was back in the pasture and the fence was cobbled together well enough to hold for the week, Wade's temper was frayed down to the wire. He came back to the house to find Eliza on the porch with a tin cup of cold water waiting for him, which was a small thing. He almost didn't register it, but he took the water and drank it in 2 long swallows and stood there with his hands on his knees catching his breath, and when he straightened up, she was watching him with that direct look. "The post in Section 4 has been going," she said. "I noticed it last week. I should have mentioned it." "You noticed a fence post." "I walked the near pasture in the evening, something to do." She paused. "I noticed it, and I didn't say anything because I wasn't sure. I didn't know how you'd take it, me pointing out problems." He looked at her for a long moment. "In the future," he said, "point them out." "All right." He handed the tin cup back. Their fingers didn't quite touch. I don't need managing," he said, "but I'm short 2 eyes, and you apparently have a good set of them. Be a waste not to use them." The corner of her mouth moved again in that almost smile she had. "Agreed," she said, and went back inside. He stood on the porch for another minute. The heat pressed down and the land spread out flat and dry in every direction, and it was the same land it had always been, harsh and demanding and indifferent. But something about that 2-minute exchange felt different from most of the conversations he'd had in the last 4 years. He couldn't say why. He went to the barn to deal with the rest of the morning. Town once a week on Tuesdays was part of his pattern. He'd always gone alone. In September, she asked to come, and he didn't have a reason to say no, so she rode in the wagon beside him without conversation for the first several miles. And then they talked. About the ranch, mostly, which was becoming the texture of their relationship, a working conversation that happened to be between 2 people who were slowly, incrementally, learning each other. In town, she stopped at the dry goods store while he went to the mill. When he came back with the wagon loaded with feed sacks, she was coming out of the store with a bolt of plain cotton cloth under her arm, and she wasn't alone. She was talking to a woman he recognized, Della Marsh, who was married to the bank manager, Frank Marsh, and was the kind of woman who collected information the way some people collected furniture. He could tell from Della's posture that the conversation was not simple small talk. There was a quality to it, a leanness, a pulling close. He watched Eliza's face. The composure was there, but the warmth he sometimes saw in it at home was not. She was being pleasant and giving nothing. He drove the wagon up and she saw him and took that as her exit, climbing onto the bench with an ease that still surprised him every time. "Friend of yours?" he said as they pulled out of town. She introduced herself. She set the cloth bolt across her lap. She asked where I was from. "What did you tell her?" "Illinois," which is true. She looked at her hands. She also asked whether I'd been married before. "What'd you say?" "That I hadn't." She glanced at him sideways. She seemed disappointed. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Della Marsh is disappointed when she can't find something to talk about. "She'll find something," Eliza said, with a flatness that suggested she'd been the subject of talk before and knew how these things went and was not enjoying the prospect. He thought about that for a while as the road unspooled east toward home. "What is there to find?" he said, finally. He kept his voice neutral, not accusatory. "About you. If she were to look." The silence lasted about 15 seconds. "I'm not hiding anything that would harm you or the ranch," she said carefully. "That's not exactly what I asked." "I know." She watched the road. "There are circumstances in my past that I'm not ready to explain. I'd ask you to trust that they're not relevant to this." She seemed to be choosing her words with great care. "To what we're building here." He thought about that. He thought about the letters. He thought about the look in her face when she took them. "All right," he said. She glanced at him. Surprised, he thought. "Just all right? I haven't told you everything about myself either," he said. "People get to have what they hold close, as long as it's not a lie that's going to come at us sideways." She looked at him for a moment longer than she usually did. Something in her expression shifted. Not much, just enough that he noticed. "It won't," she said quietly. He nodded and kept driving. The double M came into view at the end of the long, straight road, the same way it always did, low and plain and sun-battered, the barn casting a long afternoon shadow, the near pasture fence just barely holding. His home, battered as it was. For the first time in a long while, coming back to it didn't feel quite so much like returning to something empty. He didn't know what to do with that feeling. So he did what he always did, unhitched the horse, unloaded the feed, went back to work. But the feeling stayed. The gossip got to Wade before Della Marsh meant it to, which was probably the one miscalculation in her otherwise efficient operation. He heard it from Tom Briggs, who rode over on a Thursday morning in late September with a calf he'd promised to sell and stayed for coffee the way he always did, sitting at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands, talking about nothing much, and then talking about the thing he'd actually come to talk about. "People are wondering about her," Tom said. "Not mean about it, just plain. People wonder about everything new," Wade said. "These letters she gets." Tom wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "From back east, Philadelphia, New York. Caldwell's been talking." "Caldwell always talks." "Wade." Tom set the cup down. "Frank Marsh ran a quiet inquiry through his banking contacts in Abilene." He paused. "The name Hartwell. It came back with something attached to it. He wouldn't say what exactly, just that it was significant. His word." Wade looked at him steadily. "Significant." That's what he said. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of Eliza out at the side of the house, where she'd been pulling weeds from the neglected kitchen garden she'd decided to resurrect. He could hear the soft rhythm of the work, the pull and shake, the dirt falling back. "What exactly is Marsh suggesting?" Wade said. "Nothing. He's not suggesting anything." Tom picked up his cup again. "I'm just telling you what's being said." After Tom left, Wade stood at the kitchen window for a while. Outside, Eliza had moved along the garden row and was crouched over a patch of dried-out soil with the same focused expression she brought to everything. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbow. There was a streak of dirt across her forearm. He went out. "Tom Briggs was here," he said. She looked up. Something in his tone reached her because she stopped working and sat back on her heels. "I know, I heard the horse. He told me Frank Marsh has been asking questions about the Hartwell name." A pause. Not long, but heavy. She looked back at the garden row, and for a moment her hands were very still in her lap. "What did he find?" she asked, and her voice was careful, controlled. Tom didn't say exactly, just that it came back significant. He watched her face. "That's a loaded word." "It is," she agreed. She got to her feet slowly, brushing the dirt from her skirt with short, precise movements. She wasn't going to tell him. He could see it, the decision happening behind her eyes, the same way he'd seen it the day she took that first letter from the table. She was measuring what she could say against what she wasn't ready to. "Eliza," he said it quietly. "I told you before, you can hold what you hold close. I meant that. But if something's coming, I'd rather know it's coming." She looked at him fully then. In the direct Texas light, her face was harder to read than usual. Or maybe she was working harder at it. "Nothing is coming that will harm you," she said. "I promise you that." "That's the second time you've promised me that. Because it's true both times." She held his gaze. "There are people who want to find me. People from my past, not dangerous people. People with claims and intentions I haven't sorted out yet. The letters are part of that." She stopped. "I know that's not a full answer." "No," he said. "It's not. I'm not ready to give the full answer." She said it without apology, but without hardness either. There was something in her voice that was tired, he thought. Tired in the way of someone who had been carrying a heavy thing for a long time. "I will be. Not yet." He stood there for a moment. The morning was already hot, the air tasting of dust and dry grass, the sky a flat, empty blue that went on forever in every direction. He was a man who didn't like loose ends, who liked problems that had edges he could see. This was not that kind of problem. "All right," he said for the second time. She blinked. "You keep saying that, because I keep meaning it." He picked up the garden fork she'd set down and held it out to her. "Finish your row. I've got fence work." She took the fork, and he walked back to the barn. And he didn't look back, but he thought about that conversation for the rest of the day. October came in dry and mean, the way October sometimes did in West Texas. Not cold yet, just stripped of everything soft. The wind picking up an edge that hadn't been there in September. The herd needed moving to the winter pasture before the grass gave out completely on the east section, and that was a full 2-day operation with all 3 of them working. Eliza came without being asked. He didn't tell her she couldn't. He'd stopped making that mistake in September. She wasn't a cattle hand. She said so herself with the bluntness he'd come to expect. "I don't know what I'm doing out here. Just tell me where to be," he told her. She stayed where he put her and did what he said without complaint. And when Tommy's horse spooked at the dry creek crossing and sent him sideways off the saddle into the dirt, she was off her horse and at his side before Wade had covered half the distance. Tommy was fine, scraped up, embarrassed, but she'd checked his shoulder with quick, practical hands and declared nothing broken with more confidence than Wade expected. "Where'd you learn that?" he said, later. "I spent a winter on a property in Ohio when I was 16, she said. The man who ran it had 5 children and a wife who had no patience. Somebody was always getting hurt. You moved around a lot." She considered this. "I moved around a lot," she agreed without elaborating. That night they made camp at the edge of the winter pasture. Pete and Tommy near the fire with their bedrolls, Wade a few yards off, and Eliza another few yards from Wade, which was the arrangement she'd made without discussion, and which he hadn't questioned. The fire was low. The stars came out the way they only did that far from town, enormous and crowded, the kind of sky that made a man feel small in a way that was almost a relief. He wasn't sleeping. He was watching the fire die down and thinking about the banknote in Abilene, which was never far from his mind these days. The numbers were not getting better. He'd managed to keep the payments current, barely, but the winter ahead was going to be a test he wasn't sure he'd pass. "You're not sleeping," Eliza said from her side of the camp. "No." A pause. "Is it the money?" He thought about denying it. Among other things, she was quiet for a moment. "How bad is the note?" "Bad enough." "Tell me the number." He told her. He didn't know why he did it. He hadn't told Tom, hadn't told Pete, hadn't told anyone, because the shame of it was woven into the truth of it, and they were hard to separate. He said the number out into the dark, and it hung there in the cold air. She didn't say anything for a long time. He thought maybe she'd gone to sleep after all. "It's manageable," she said finally. "Not from where I'm standing. From where you're standing, you've been managing it alone for 3 years. She paused. "You're not standing alone anymore." He didn't answer. He lay on his back looking at the sky, and the cold got deeper, and at some point he slept. What he hadn't expected, what he hadn't allowed himself to expect, was that he would come to rely on her. Not in the way he'd written to the agency about. Not the practical, transactional reliance of a household being run, though that was true too. Something more than that, and more uncomfortable than that, because it had no clear edges. He noticed it in the way a conversation became the thing he was moving toward at the end of a day. Not any particular conversation, just her. Her directness. The way she didn't soften bad news. The way she laughed, rarely, and when it happened it was sudden and real, not decorative. The way she sometimes sat at the kitchen table in the evenings with a book she'd borrowed from the small collection at the Harlan's Crossing General Store and read without needing the room to be doing anything. He noticed it, and he kept his distance from it. He was a man who'd loved a woman and lost her, and had the scar of it still, and he knew exactly how much damage that kind of openness could do if you weren't careful. So he was careful. He kept the conversation on the ranch. He kept his expressions flat. He was honest about practical things, and private about everything else. She seemed to understand that about him and matched it with her own version of distance, which made things both easier and harder. And then November came, and with November came the letter that was different from the others. He knew it was different before she said a word. He'd picked up the mail on a Tuesday, same as always, and there were 2 of them this time, both with the same Philadelphia address, both marked in the same firm, slanted handwriting. He brought them home and set them on the table, and she came in from outside, saw them, and stood very still, She took them both, but she didn't put them in her pocket this time. She stood at the kitchen table and opened the first one and read it, and he watched her face change in a way he hadn't seen before. The composure didn't break exactly. It was more like something beneath it shifted. Some deep structural thing, like a foundation settling. "Bad news?" he said. "Old news," she said quietly. Coming to a head, she folded the letter carefully and set it down. "I need to think. Take your time." She looked at him. "I won't be here for supper." He paused. "All right." She went to her room and stayed there the rest of the afternoon. He ate with Pete and Tommy in the bunkhouse, which he hadn't done in months, and Pete asked nothing, and Tommy, to his credit, also asked nothing, though his face said plenty. She was in the kitchen when he came back to the house that evening, sitting at the table with both letters open in front of her and the household ledger beside them, though she wasn't looking at any of it, just sitting there with her hands flat on the table, staring at the lamp. He sat down across from her, didn't say anything. After a minute, she said, "Do you know the name Hartwell? The Hartwell Trading Company out of Philadelphia?" Something tugged at his memory. He'd heard it vaguely in some context. "Shipping," he said, "or commerce of some kind. East Coast." "My father built it," she said, "from almost nothing, over 30 years. By the time he died 18 months ago, it was worth—" She stopped. She pressed her lips together. "A very large sum." He waited. "He had no sons," she continued, still looking at the lamp rather than at him. "He had me, and he put everything to me, all of it, in a trust that became mine outright on my 25th birthday." She paused again. "Which is in March." The kitchen was very quiet. He could hear the wind outside, the creak of the house settling. His mind was doing something slow and methodical, the way it did when a situation had more weight than he'd initially calculated. "How large a sum?" he said. It wasn't a question exactly. She told him. It was not a number he had ever held in his mind in relation to a person he knew. It was abstract, the way a distance too great to walk was abstract. He sat with it for a moment, trying to make it real. "And the letters," he said. "Lawyers, trust administrators. Her, people my father employed, who have opinions about what I should be doing." She finally looked at him. Her eyes were tired in a way they hadn't been before. "And a man in Philadelphia named Arthur Selden, who my father considered a suitable match, who has not accepted that I left." "What do you mean, not accepted it?" "He wrote to the agency." Her voice was flat now, controlled. "He found out I'd come here, to Texas. To—" She gestured vaguely at the room. "Here." Something cold moved through Wade's chest. "What does he want?" "To come and retrieve me, I think," she said, with a bitterness that was probably the most unguarded thing he'd heard her say. "As though I'm a parcel someone misdelivered." He looked at her across the table. This woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in July with one trunk and a level gaze, and had spent 4 months reorganizing his finances and learning his fence lines and working cattle beside him in the October heat. This woman who had kept all of this, inside the narrow space of her composure, carrying it through every ordinary day. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. And he tried to keep judgment out of it, because he genuinely didn't know if he had the right to it. She met his eyes. "Because I needed to know," she said slowly, "whether you could see me as a person first, before you knew." She pressed her hands flat on the table. "You have no idea what it's like to have that kind of money attached to your name. People stop seeing you. They start seeing the money, every gesture, every act of kindness. It gets filtered through that." Her voice had gotten quieter, but harder. "My father's friends looked at me like an asset. Arthur Selden looked at me like an asset. The women who called themselves my friends—" She stopped, shook her head. "I needed to come somewhere that didn't already know. I needed to know that someone could—" She stopped again, and this time she didn't finish the sentence. He sat with that for a long moment. The lamp flickered in a draft from under the door. He was angry. He was honest enough with himself to know that. Not a hot anger. More like the cold, slow kind that came from feeling like something had been decided for you without your knowledge. He told her his banknote. He'd sat across from her in the dark during the cattle drive and said the number out loud and felt the shame of it. And all that time she'd been sitting on that. But he was also something else, something he didn't have clean language for, because he understood it. He understood it in a way that was inconvenient. He stood up, walked to the window, and stood there with his back to her, looking out at the dark yard and the faint shapes of the barn and the pasture beyond. "This man," he said, "Selden, what are you going to do?" "I'm going to write to my lawyers and make clear he has no standing," she said. "He doesn't, legally, he has nothing. My father expressed a preference, but it wasn't binding. And the money, the trust. In March, it's mine outright. No administrators, no conditions." And then the silence stretched. He turned around. She was watching him with an expression he hadn't seen on her before, wary. And behind the wariness, something more stripped down. Afraid, he thought. Not of the situation, of him. "I don't know what you want me to say," she said quietly. "I didn't lie to you. I withheld something. I know that's not a clean line." "No," he said. "It's not." "Are you—" She stopped, tried again. "What are you going to do?" He looked at her. This woman who had pulled his kitchen garden out of 6 years of neglect and caught the fence post before it went down and eaten at his table every evening without needing the room to be anything other than what it was. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "I need to think." He went to his room. He didn't slam the door. He sat on the edge of his bed in the dark for a long time, turning the whole thing over in his mind. The anger and the understanding and the cold number she'd told him and the look on her face when she'd said, "I needed to know whether you could see me as a person first." He didn't sleep much that night, but somewhere around 3 in the morning, the anger and the understanding settled into something quieter. Not resolution, just the beginning of it. Outside, the wind moved across the flat land, and the house held against it the way it always had, imperfect and battered and still standing. He didn't bring it up the next morning. She was in the kitchen when he came out, same as every morning. Coffee on the stove, the smell of cornbread from the oven, the ordinary machinery of the household running as it always did. She looked at him when he came in, and he looked back, and there was a moment where the weight of the previous night sat between them like a physical thing. Then he poured his coffee and sat down, and she set the bread on the table and sat across from him, and neither of them spoke about it. They didn't speak about it the next day either, nor the day after that. It wasn't avoidance exactly. It was more like two people circling something at a careful distance, both of them aware of it, neither of them ready to step closer. The work of the ranch didn't stop for difficult feelings. The herd still needed managing, the fence still needed attention, the cold was coming and there was firewood to split. And so they worked, and they talked about the work, and they ate their meals and spent their evenings in the same room, and the thing between them stayed exactly where they'd left it. Pete and Tommy, to their credit, noticed nothing. Or chose to notice nothing, which was essentially the same. What changed in those quiet days was something harder to name. Wade found himself watching her differently. Not with suspicion, he'd moved past that mostly, but with a kind of recalculation. He was trying to reconcile the woman he'd come to know with the woman she'd told him she was. The Eliza who'd walked his fence line and asked him point blank about the banknote and sat in the dark during the cattle drive saying, "You're not standing alone anymore." And the Eliza who was heir to a fortune that made his entire life's labor look like loose change. He couldn't fit them together cleanly. That was the problem. On the 4th day, he came in from the barn at midday to find her at the kitchen table with a letter she was writing, not reading. She covered it when he came in, a reflex, not quite fast enough, and he saw his own name in the salutation before the paper turned over. He stopped. "What's that?" he said. She looked at him steadily. "A letter to my attorneys in Philadelphia." "About the trust?" "Yes." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. His coat was still on. His hands were cold from the morning work, and he wrapped them around nothing because there was no coffee within reach. "What are you telling them?" She hesitated for only a second. "That I intend to remain in Texas. That the matter of Arthur Selden is closed and not to be reopened. And that I want the trust documentation sent to a bank in Abilene rather than Philadelphia." She paused. "In my name only." "Why Abilene?" "Because it's the nearest city with a proper bank." She watched him. "Because I live here." He sat with that. Outside, the wind had come up again, pushing a thin veil of dust against the window glass, a sound like dry whispers. "Wade," she said, and his name in her voice was different than it usually was. Quieter, more careful. "I know I owe you more than what I told you the other night. I know I left it incomplete." "You did." "I was afraid," she said simply. Not as an excuse, just as the fact it was. "I've been afraid of this conversation since the day I got off that stagecoach, because I knew that when it happened, everything would change. The way you looked at me, the way you thought about all of it." She pressed her hand flat on the letter. "And I didn't want it to change. Whatever else is complicated, that part is not." He looked at her across the table. The winter light was flat and gray and made everything look more exposed than the summer light had. She looked tired still, and underneath the tiredness, something that was holding its breath. "It did change," he said. She flinched, just slightly. "I know. Not in the direction you're thinking." He said it slowly, working it out as he spoke. I don't look at you and see the money, Eliza. I'm not built that way. What changed is that I see how much you've been carrying this whole time. Every ordinary day on this ranch, you've been managing all of that on top of everything else, and you did it without—" He stopped, exhaled. "You're a harder person than I gave you credit for. That's what changed." She stared at him. "I'm still angry," he said. "I want to be straight with you about that. Not because of the money, because of the banknote conversation. Out at the winter pasture. You let me tell you how bad things were. You sat there and listened. And you already knew that whatever number I gave you was—" He pressed his lips together. "That was a gap I'm going to have to get over." "I know," she said very quietly. "I know that was wrong. I told myself it wasn't. I told myself I was still learning whether you could be trusted, whether the situation was—" She stopped. "But that's not the whole truth. The whole truth is I'd gotten used to protecting that information like it was the only shield I had, and I kept it up past the point where it made sense to." He nodded, sat there for another moment with the cold in his hands and the wind against the window. Then he said, "What does Selden want exactly?" "The real version." She'd stiffened slightly at the name, which he noted. "Arthur Selden is the kind of man who plans," she said. "He and my father had an understanding, not an agreement, nothing legal, just an understanding, that I would marry him once I came of age. I was 17 when that understanding was reached. Nobody asked me." Her voice had gone flat in the particular way it did when she was keeping something larger under control. "When my father died, and I found out the extent of the estate, I also found out that Selden had expected to manage the trust. As my husband. That was always the plan. But you left." "I left. I took what I needed. I made myself very difficult to find for about 6 months, and then I went to the agency in St. Louis." The corner of her mouth moved, but it wasn't the almost smile. It was something more bitter. "I thought I'd been careful enough." "He found you through the agency. Someone at the agency talked. I don't know who. I don't know if money changed hands." She shook her head. "It doesn't matter now. He knows I'm here. He knows I'm—" She gestured at the room again, the same vague gesture she'd used before, meaning the ranch, the arrangement, all of it. "He wrote to his contacts in Abilene. That's how Frank Marsh got involved." The pieces rearranged themselves in Wade's mind. Marsh, the bank, the quiet inquiry Tom had mentioned. "Marsh is working with Selden," he said. "I think Marsh is working for Marsh," she said. "He knows about the trust. He knows I'll have direct access to it in March. And a woman with that kind of money moving it to a bank in his territory would be—" She paused. "Valuable. If he can make himself useful to Selden or to me, he gains either way. That's a cold calculation." "It's a banker's calculation." She said it without malice. "I don't blame him for the instinct. I blame him for involving himself in my personal affairs to do it." Wade sat back in his chair. The whole picture had weight now. A different kind of weight than the abstract threat of bad letters from Philadelphia. This was local. This was Frank Marsh, who ran the bank in Harlan's Crossing and whose wife Della had asked Eliza pointed questions outside the dry goods store 2 months ago. This was a man 2 towns over who felt he had a claim on this woman's future, and had apparently decided 12 miles of Texas wasn't enough to stop him from pressing it. Something hardened in Wade's chest, simple and cold, the way it always did when a threat had a specific shape. "When is he coming?" he said. Her eyes sharpened. "What makes you think he's coming?" "Because men like that don't work through letters once they know where to find you." He looked at her directly. "When?" She swallowed. "The last letter said he had business in Abilene in December. He didn't say he'd come further west, but he will." She looked at her hands. "Probably." He stood up, took his coat off and hung it by the door, which he'd forgotten to do when he came in, because his mind had been elsewhere. He went to the stove and poured himself the coffee he'd needed since he sat down. "We'll deal with that when it comes," he said. She looked up at him. "Wade, this isn't your problem to deal with. You live on my ranch," he said. He paused. The word he needed was not one he'd used about her before, and something in saying it aloud felt like a line being crossed. But he said it anyway, because it was true. "You're my wife, in the way that matters out here. That makes your problems my problems." She stared at him for a long moment. Something crossed her face that he didn't look at too closely, because it was the kind of expression that required a response he wasn't ready to give. "All right," she said, very softly. "Finish your letter," he said. "Tell your lawyers what you told me, and tell them if Selden attempts contact with anyone at the Double M, they should be prepared to hear from me." He picked up his coffee. "I'm going back out." He went. "One." December came in cold and gray, the way the plains did it. Not the dramatic cold of the mountains, just a dry, seeping cold that got into the bones of the house and stayed. They burned more wood. The mornings were slower. The cattle huddled at the south end of the winter pasture where the creek bank broke the wind, and Pete developed a cough that Wade made him rest for 3 days over strong protest. Selden arrived on a Wednesday. Wade saw the horse first, a hired animal from the Abilene livery, too well kept for a working ranch horse, ridden by a man in a coat that had not been bought west of the Mississippi. He pulled up at the fence gate in the mid-afternoon, and by the time Wade reached him, Eliza had come out onto the porch. Arthur Selden was about 50, Wade guessed. Well-made in the way of men who'd never done physical work, heavy through the middle, but carrying it with confidence, silver at the temples, a face that had learned authority early and worn it ever since. He had the kind of eyes that assessed everything they looked at, and they assessed Wade quickly, precisely, and then moved to Eliza on the porch. "Miss Hartwell," he said. He didn't get off his horse. "Mr. Selden." Her voice from the porch was level as a carpenter's line. He looked around the ranch, the barn, the battered house, the flat, hard land. His expression didn't move into contempt exactly. It was more polished than that. But the evaluation was happening, and they all knew it. "You've put yourself a long way from civilization," he said. "I've put myself exactly where I intended to be," she said. His eyes moved back to Wade, who was standing at the fence gate with his arms loose at his sides. "You'd be Mercer." "I would. I've heard about you, from Frank Marsh." A pause. "You're carrying a substantial note with the Abilene Bank." The air went tight. Wade kept his face still. "Most ranchers in West Texas carry a note. That's not news." "No," Selden agreed pleasantly, "but the size of yours is somewhat remarkable for the size of your operation." He smiled, and it was the smile of a man who was accustomed to having information other people didn't have. "I'm not here to cause trouble, Mercer. I'm here to talk to Eliza." "She seems to be talking fine from where she is," Wade said. Selden's smile stayed in place. He looked back at Eliza on the porch. "I think you know why I've come." "I do," she said. "And I think you know my answer hasn't changed." "Your answer was a young woman's impulsive decision," he said, still pleasant, still carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "You're about to come into a significant inheritance. What you do with that, how it's managed, those decisions have consequences for a great many people. Your father understood that." "My father is dead," she said. "What he understood no longer governs what I do." Something shifted in Selden's expression. Not much, just a tightening around the eyes. "You're being foolish, and you're being foolish in front of someone who, with respect, has every financial reason to encourage your foolishness." Wade stepped forward from the gate. Not quickly, deliberately. He stopped at the horse's shoulder and looked up at Selden from that distance, which required the man to look down at him, which was the point. "I'm going to ask you to be careful about your next sentence," Wade said quietly, "because we're still being polite, and I'd like to keep it that way." Selden looked at him for a moment. The assessment again, quicker this time, reading the stillness in the man in front of him, the flat gray eyes, the set of the shoulders. "I'm not your enemy, Mercer. I didn't say you were. I said to be careful." A silence. The wind moved across the yard, lifting a small spiral of dust near the barn. Somewhere in the pasture, a steer made a complaint about nothing in particular. Selden gathered his reins. "I'll be in Abilene through Christmas," he said, to Eliza rather than to Wade. "I'd encourage you to think carefully about what you're doing here, before March." "I've thought about it extensively," she said. "My decision is the same." He held her gaze for another moment. Then he turned his horse and rode back toward the road, and the three of them, Wade, Eliza on the porch, and the ranch itself, watched him go. When the sound of hooves had faded, neither of them spoke for a full minute. Then Tommy's voice came from behind the barn, where he'd apparently been listening the entire time. "Who was that?" "Nobody," Wade said. He walked back to the house. On the porch, Eliza was gripping the post at the corner with one hand, and he could see that her knuckles were white. He stopped beside her without touching her, close enough that she knew he was there. "You all right?" he said. "Yes." A beat. "No." She let out a slow breath. "He won't stop. A visit doesn't end it for a man like him." "I know. He'll go after the banknote. Through Marsh. He'll use the money to maneuver you, because he thinks he can." She turned to look at him, and the fear was back, the real kind, the kind she didn't let out often. "Wade, I don't want you caught in the middle of this. This was never supposed to be your burden." He looked at her, at the white knuckles on the porch post, and the fear she was trying to manage down, and the 4 months of ordinary days she'd spent building something on this harsh, imperfect piece of land before any of this had erupted into the open. "I've been in the middle of it since July," he said. "I just didn't know it." He paused. "Doesn't change anything." She searched his face. How are you not angrier than this?" He thought about it honestly. "I'm angry," he said. "I told you that. But anger's like water in this country. You spend it on the wrong things. You run dry when you need it." He looked out at the road where Selden had gone. "I'll need it later. I'm saving it." She stared at him for a long moment, and then something in her face shifted. The fear didn't disappear, but something else settled over it, like weight finding a more even distribution. She didn't say anything else, but she let go of the post, and when she turned to go inside, her shoulder brushed his arm, and neither of them moved away from it. He stayed on the porch alone for a while after she'd gone in. The afternoon was dying out at the edges of the sky, going orange and then red, and then the deep particular purple of a plains sunset. The ranch sat in it the way it always did, battered and unglamorous and still standing. He thought about the banknote. He thought about Selden's smile. He thought about Eliza's knuckles white on the post, and the way she'd said this was never supposed to be your burden. Like she'd spent 4 months here and still hadn't quite believed she was allowed to let anything be shared. He went inside. The lamp was on in the kitchen, and supper was going, and the smell of it reached him before he'd crossed the threshold. And it was warm in the way the house had not been warm in years. And he stood for a moment in the doorway, just absorbing that plainly, without trying to make it into anything more than what it was. Supper was quiet. They ate. The wind pushed at the walls of the house, and it held against them, the same as it always had. Selden's visit left a residue that didn't wash off easily. It wasn't that anything dramatic happened in the days after. No second visit, no letter, no further word from Frank Marsh. The ranch ran as it always had. The cold deepened into December proper, and the ordinary work of winter filled the hours the way it always did. But something had shifted in the quality of the silence between Wade and Eliza. The careful distance they'd maintained since November was still there, but it had changed character. It was no longer the distance of two people circling something unknown. It was the distance of two people who knew exactly what was between them and hadn't yet decided what to do about it. Wade felt it most in the evenings, when the day's work was done and the house was quiet and there was nothing left to occupy his hands or his attention. He'd sit at one end of the kitchen table, and she'd sit at the other, and they'd exist in the same space in a way that had become entirely natural and entirely complicated at the same time. She'd read or write letters or work figures in the ledger. He'd mend something or look over the land maps he kept in the bottom drawer. And the lamp would burn down between them, and neither of them would be the first to say goodnight. Tom Briggs came by on a Friday in mid-December, and this time he didn't bother with the pretense of the calf he wanted to sell. He came in, accepted coffee, and sat down at the kitchen table while Eliza was outside feeding the chickens she'd acquired in October from a neighbor who'd sold his smaller operation and needed them moved. Tom watched Wade through 2 long sips before he said what he'd come to say. "Marsh called in a favor with the Abilene Bank," Tom said. Wade set his cup down. "What kind of favor?" "The kind that involves your note." Tom looked uncomfortable in the specific way of a man delivering news he didn't want to carry. "He's asked them to accelerate the payment schedule, full balance by March 1st. The number sat in Wade's chest like a stone. Full balance by March 1st was not possible, not even close to possible. They both knew it. "Can he do that?" Wade said. "He's on the board of directors. He's got a majority stake in their lending committee." Tom shook his head. "Technically, the bank has grounds. You've made minimum payments, but the overall balance hasn't come down much. They can argue default risk." "Marsh put him up to it," Wade said flatly. "Well, Selden. I'd bet my ranch on it." Wade was quiet for a moment. The kitchen felt smaller than usual. He could hear Eliza's voice outside, talking to the chickens in the low, conversational way she did, which under any other circumstance he would have found quietly amusing. "What happens if I can't pay March 1st, he said, though he knew. "They moved to seize the land." Tom met his eyes. "Wade, I'm sorry. I know you've worked this place. How long have you known?" "I heard it yesterday. Came straight here." Wade nodded. He picked up his coffee and drank it, and stared at the wall and did the arithmetic he'd been avoiding since November. There was no version of the numbers that worked. He could sell cattle. He'd have to sell at winter prices, which were bad, and he'd be thinning a herd that was already too thin. He could borrow from Tom, who didn't have that kind of money. He could go to a different bank, but Marsh's reach in this part of Texas was long, and getting a new note approved before March was a fantasy. He was looking at losing the double M. After Tom left, he sat at the table for a long time. Long enough that Eliza came in, put the egg basket on the counter, and stopped when she read the room. "What happened?" she said. He told her, plain and complete, the way he'd learned she preferred. She listened without interrupting, standing at the counter with her hands still, and when he'd finished, she was quiet for a moment. "March 1st, she said. "Yes." She nodded once. Her expression had gone into the accounting mode, that focused, interior calculation he'd come to recognize. "I'll need to send a letter to Philadelphia tomorrow," she said. "Eliza." "It's practical," she said. She looked at him. "You know it is." "I'm not taking your money." The words came out before he'd fully shaped them, and they were more jagged than he'd intended. She looked at him steadily, not flinching from the sharpness of it. "Why not?" she said. Simply. Not a challenge, an actual question. "Because that's not—" He stopped, stood up and moved to the window because he needed to not be sitting still. "That's not how this works. A man doesn't take a woman's fortune to save his own land. That's not— I won't be that." "That man," she said carefully, "being Arthur Selden." He turned. "What?" "You're afraid of looking like Selden." She said it without accusation. "A man who wants the money attached to the woman." The accuracy of it landed badly, the way accurate things often did. He didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. "Wade." She came around the table and stopped a few feet from him, closer than she usually stood. "You are the least similar person to Arthur Selden that I have ever met in my life. The fact that you're standing there refusing help because of your pride is actually proof of that." She paused. "He would have had the bank papers on this land inside a week and called it taking care of me." "It's still your money." "It's money I didn't earn and didn't ask for, and have spent 18 months trying to figure out what to do with." Her voice was still level, but there was something underneath it now that wasn't. "It's money that has done nothing but complicate my life and attract men who want to manage it for me. If I use some of it to keep a piece of land in the hands of the man who—" She stopped, pressed her lips together, tried again. "In the hands of someone who deserves it. That's not charity, that's a decision." He looked at her. The winter light was flat through the window behind him, and she was standing there with the egg basket still on the counter and her hair slightly undone from the cold outside and her eyes very serious, and he thought, not for the first time, about the incongruity of her. How she kept being more than the space he'd tried to put her in. "I need to think about it," he said. "All right," she said, "think about it. But March is not far." She went back to her side of the kitchen, and the conversation was over, and he stood at the window for a long time after. He thought about it for 3 days. He went through every other option methodically and found them wanting, the way he'd known he would. He sat with his pride and examined it from several angles and tried to determine whether it was the principled kind or the stupid kind, which were not always easy to tell apart. On the 4th day, he went to find her. She was in the barn with Pete, who had recovered from his cough and was back at work, helping sort through the stored feed to estimate how much they had left for winter. Wade stopped in the barn doorway. "Pete," he said, "give us a minute." Pete gave them a minute without any particular expression. When he was gone, Eliza turned from the feed barrels and looked at Wade, waiting. "I don't want it to be a loan," he said. "I'm not going to pretend I'll pay it back by some schedule that doesn't exist." "I know," she said. "And I don't want it to change what this is." He meant the ranch, the arrangement, the daily working life they'd made, but he was aware he also might mean something else, and she was probably aware of that too. "It won't," she said. "You don't know that." "No," she admitted, "but I know what I intend." He stood there for a moment longer. Then he nodded, short and decided, the way he made up his mind about most things once he'd made it up. "Write your letter," he said. She nodded back. And that was how it was settled, without ceremony or sentiment, the way most real decisions got made between two people who understood each other well enough to skip the parts that didn't matter. What happened next, Wade did not know until after it was done. He'd assumed she was writing to her attorneys to arrange a portion of the trust, enough to cover the note, some arrangement that would let him reclaim the loan documentation from the Abilene bank before Marsh's deadline. He'd assumed there'd be correspondence back and forth, lawyers involved, a process that would take weeks and leave him in an uncomfortable state of obligation while it crawled forward. What he had not assumed was that she would handle it entirely herself, directly and completely. He found out on a Monday in the second week of January when he rode to Abilene to speak with the bank about buying time on the payment schedule, a conversation he'd been dreading and had put off as long as he could. He tied his horse outside the bank and went in and asked for the loans manager. The loans manager, a thin man named Devereaux who Wade had spoken to 3 times in the past year and who had the professional sympathy of a man who delivered bad news enough times to stop feeling it, came out of his office with an expression that was not what Wade had expected. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "I'm glad you've come in. I was going to write to you this week about the acceleration notice, about the resolution of your account." Devereaux paused with the faint discomfort of a man managing a situation he didn't entirely understand. "The outstanding balance on your note was settled, in full, 3 weeks ago." Wade looked at him. "Settled," he said. "Yes, sir. By a third party, a legal representative acting on behalf of a trust account." He produced a paper from his folder and set it on the counter. "Full settlement. Clean title to the double M goes to you. No encumbrances." Wade looked at the paper. The numbers on it were real. The signature of the trust representative was real, 3 weeks ago, which was before their conversation in the kitchen, before he'd told her to write the letter. She'd done it before he'd agreed to it. The ride home was 12 miles, and he felt all of them. He turned the fact of it over in his mind the entire way. The shape of what she'd done. The order of it. She hadn't waited for his decision. She hadn't asked for his permission, which she had not needed, and both of them knew it. She had simply done it, quietly, without announcement, and then come to him in the kitchen and offered him the choice as though the decision was still open. He didn't know how to feel about it. He tried anger first because anger was familiar and because there was something in being handled, even kindly, that chafed. He was a man who made his own decisions. He'd told her that plainly more than once. But the anger didn't hold, and he knew why it didn't hold, because she hadn't done it to take the decision from him. She'd done it to take the gun out of Marsh's hand before Marsh could use it. She'd done it because March was coming, and the lawyers moved slowly and she didn't trust the timeline. She'd done it the way she did everything, practically, without waste. He rode into the yard and untied his horse and put her in the barn, and when he came out, Eliza was at the porch with her coat on, carrying a bucket of water from the pump. She saw his face, and she stopped. They looked at each other. "Devereaux told you," she said. "He told me." She set the bucket down. "Before you say anything, why before I agreed to it?" "Because Selden was going to move through marsh the moment he thought you were still vulnerable." She met his eyes directly. "I didn't have time to wait for you to finish wrestling with your pride." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "You couldn't have told me?" "I was going to. I was waiting for—" She stopped. "I wanted it done first, so it was a fact and not a negotiation." She looked at him steadily, and underneath the steadiness there was the same thing he'd seen on the porch when Selden came. Not fear exactly, but its close neighbor. "I know I should have told you. I know I keep making decisions on your behalf that I don't have the right to make. I know that." Her voice had gotten quieter. "But I couldn't watch him take this from you. I couldn't stand by and watch it happen when it was in my power to stop it." He stood there in this cold yard for a long moment. The words sat on him with a particular weight. "I couldn't watch him take this from you." Not said to gain anything, not said to manage him or to perform generosity. Said because it was the plain truth of why she'd done it. He thought about the morning she'd had water waiting for him on the porch after the fence collapse. He thought about her voice in the dark at the winter pasture saying, "You're not standing alone anymore." He thought about the way she'd stood in the center of that ordinary, faded room on her first day here, as if she was deciding something. She had been deciding something. She'd been deciding this. "Come inside, he said. "It's cold." She picked up the bucket. They went in. At the kitchen table, he sat down, and she sat across from him, same as always, and there was a silence that had a different quality than the silences before. It was lighter, somehow, like something had been set down. "I'm not going to keep pretending I don't know what's happening here," he said. His voice was even. He'd thought about this for 12 miles on horseback, and he was going to say it plainly. "Between us, I'm not going to keep pretending it's just practical." She was very still. "I'm not good at this," he said. "I was bad at it the first time, and I'm worse now. I'm not going to tell you things that aren't true about what I can offer. This land is hard, and the winters are hard, and I am—" He paused. "I'm not an easy man to know." "I know that," she said. "You know part of it." "I know more than you think," she said quietly. "I've been watching you for 5 months, Wade. You're not as hidden as you believe you are." He looked at her. Something in him was moving the way the creek moved in early spring. Reluctant, slow, with the weight of a long freeze behind it. "I don't want to lose you," he said. "When March comes and the trust is yours and Selden's been put away for good, I don't want this to be the place you passed through." She looked at him for a long time. The lamp was between them on the table, burning low, and outside the wind had gone quiet for once, and the house was still. "This is the first place," she said carefully, "where someone knew the worst version of my circumstances and didn't change." She paused. "You were angry. You're still angry sometimes, but you didn't change." Her voice had the quality of something said only once, because it only needed to be said once. "That's not a small thing to me." He reached across the table. He wasn't graceful about it. His hand was rough and cold, and he set it over hers without ceremony, because ceremony wasn't something either of them did well, and they both knew it. She turned her hand over beneath his, and they sat like that while the lamp burned, in the plain kitchen of a plain ranch house, at the edge of a hard and indifferent land. And it was not romantic in any way a person might write about, but it was real. It was the most real thing he'd felt in 4 years. Outside, the wind came back, pushing at the walls of the double M the way it always had. The house held. The hand across the table was not a proposal. It was not a declaration. It was two people who had spent 5 months learning each other in the hardest possible conditions, finally admitting, without much ceremony, that they had stopped pretending. The actual proposal came 11 days later, on a cold Tuesday morning when Wade was supposed to be checking the south fence line and instead found himself standing in the kitchen doorway watching Eliza work through the household accounts, with a pencil stub she kept tucking behind her ear, and then forgetting and then reaching for and finding gone. And the whole small repeated sequence of it was so ordinary and so specifically her that something in him simply finished deciding. "I'd like to get married," he said. "Properly. if you're willing. She looked up from the ledger. The pencil was behind her ear. She'd forgotten it again. Properly, she repeated. In town, with the judge. Legal. She looked at him for a moment. That's the least romantic proposal I've ever heard. Have you had many? One other. A pause. It was worse. He almost smiled. Is that a yes? She found the pencil, set it down on the ledger page, and said, Yes, that's a yes. They were married on a Friday in February in Judge Calhoun's office in Harlan's Crossing, with Tom Briggs as witness, and Pete Gallegos standing in the doorway because the office wasn't large enough for more than 3 people comfortably. Tommy Strand had wanted to come and had been told to stay with the cattle, which he'd accepted with poor grace, and a gift of 2 preserved peach tins left on the kitchen table for their return. It was not a lavish ceremony. Calhoun read the words, they said what needed saying, and Wade put a ring on her finger that had belonged to his grandmother and that he'd kept in the bottom of a tin box for 15 years without knowing what he was keeping it for. Eliza had looked at it for a moment before she let him put it on. Not with sentiment exactly, but with the particular attention she brought to things that mattered. And then she'd looked at him with an expression he didn't try to name. On the ride back to the ranch, Tom rode alongside them for the first mile and talked about cattle prices and weather, which was the most generous thing he could have done, because it meant neither of them had to speak into the weight of what had just happened. When Tom peeled off toward his own land and they were alone on the road east, the silence was comfortable in the way it had become over months of shared miles. The land stretched flat and winter gray in every direction, and the Double M was still 12 miles out, and the cold sat on everything without apology. Are you all right? Wade asked. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Are you? Getting there? He said honestly. She nodded. That was enough. March came, and with it, the trust. The documentation arrived from Philadelphia in a package that required Eliza's signature at the Harlan's Crossing post office, and she signed for it with the same composed expression she brought to everything and carried it home under her arm like a bolt of cloth. That evening, she went through it at the kitchen table, page by page, while Wade sat across from her and did not ask questions because she would tell him what he needed to know. When she finished, she set the papers down and looked at the lamp for a moment. It's done, she said. It's mine outright. And Selden? His attorneys sent a final letter last week. I had my lawyers respond. She folded her hands on top of the papers. He has no legal standing. He never did. He was banking on my father's influence from beyond the grave, and that influence does not transfer. A pause. He won't come back. Wade nodded. He'll find another arrangement, she said, and there was no satisfaction in her voice, just the flatness of someone who had watched a certain kind of man operate long enough to know how they recycled their ambitions. Someone younger, probably. Someone whose father is still alive to be persuaded. That's a cold thing to say. It's a cold thing to be true. She looked at him. I'm not glad about it. I just know what he is. He was quiet for a moment, then, Frank Marsh. She had anticipated the question. I've moved the trust account to a bank in Abilene, not Marsh's institution. She said it straightforwardly. He'll lose whatever he was hoping to gain from Selden. He'll probably make trouble for us in small ways for a while, because men like that need to register their displeasure. She looked at Wade directly. We can weather small trouble. He thought about the fence posts and the bad winters, and the 83 cattle that had once been 120. Yes, he said, we can do that. She picked up the pencil from where she'd left it and looked at the papers again. There's something else I want to talk about. Tell me. She turned a page to a section she'd marked. The trust is large enough that it doesn't need to sit in a bank drawing interest. It can work. She looked up. I've been thinking about the Connolly property. He knew the property. 300 acres west of Harlan's Crossing that old Martin Connolly had been trying to sell for 2 years since his wife died and his sons had gone to California without looking back. Good land, some of it. Water access from the creek fork. He'd thought about it himself in the way a man thought about things he couldn't afford. What about it? He said carefully. I want to buy it and expand the herd. She said it plainly, without the careful hedging she'd used in earlier months. Marriage had done that, had given her a clearer footing from which to speak. Not to be grand about it, because it makes sense, The water access would protect us through another bad summer, and the extra land gives us room to build the herd back to what it should be. He looked at her, then at the papers, then out the window at the dark yard. You've been planning this for a while, he said. Since October, she admitted, when I first looked at the land map. He made the sound that was not quite a laugh. It had been happening more often lately, which Pete had noticed and commented on to Tommy in the bunkhouse with the commentary that the boss was getting human again, which Tommy had relayed to Wade with absolutely no shame and which Wade had chosen to ignore. What else? He said, because he knew there was more. She looked slightly self-conscious, which was rare enough to be notable. There's a building on Connolly's east corner. Used to be a schoolhouse. It hasn't been used in 6 years. She paused. The children in this area go without schooling half the year because the nearest teacher is in town and the road's in winter. She stopped, looked at the table. There's no library here, no place to borrow a book or read a newspaper that's less than 2 weeks old. People out here are isolated in ways that don't have to be permanent. He was watching her carefully now. I learned to read from a woman who had a small lending collection in her house, Eliza said quietly. 40 books, maybe. She let anyone come who wanted to. It changed what I thought was possible for myself. She looked up at him. I'd like to do something like that here. Start small. A few shelves in that building, whatever books I can source from the east. She paused. I know it sounds impractical. It doesn't sound impractical, he said. It sounds like a rich woman's project. It sounds like you, he said. And he meant it as the plainest kind of compliment, which she understood, because she looked at him the way she sometimes did, with the expression he'd stopped trying to name and just let be what it was. All right, she said. Buy Connolly's land, he said. Fix the schoolhouse. Do what you want to do with it. He leaned forward slightly. But we hire 2 more hands first. I'm not running 300 extra acres on Pete and Tommy's backs. Agreed, she said immediately, which told him she'd already factored that in. He shook his head slowly. October, he said. I had a lot of evenings to think, she said, with the almost smile. Ochant. The Connolly purchase closed in April. Martin Connolly shook Wade's hand and Eliza's hand and told them the land had been good to him and he hoped it would be good to them, and then he climbed into a wagon heading for the train station in Abilene, going west to California to live near his sons. Wade watched him go and thought about the way land outlasted the people who worked it, the way it kept its shape while the people changed. He thought about that a lot in the past year. They hired 2 new hands by May, brothers named Cal and Rowan Dees from a failed homestead south of the county, quiet men who worked hard and asked few questions, which were the qualities Wade prized above everything else in an employee. The herd began to grow back. The fencing on the Connolly section went up over the course of 2 hard-working months, with all 4 hands and Wade himself on the posts, and Eliza bringing water and food to the line, and occasionally holding a post herself when an extra set of hands was needed and no one was available, which Pete had stopped being surprised by sometime around March. The East Corner building got its roof repaired in June, its floor swept and leveled in July, and its first shelves, built by Tommy, who turned out to have a quiet talent for woodwork that nobody had thought to discover before, installed in August. Eliza had written to 3 book dealers in St. Louis and Philadelphia, and 1 in New York, and boxes began arriving at the Harlan's Crossing post office with a regularity that made old Caldwell deeply curious and eventually openly respectful. She didn't call it a library. She called it the reading room, which was more accurate. It was 1 large space with shelves on 3 walls, a table in the center, 4 chairs, and a small iron stove for winter. But library was what people called it, quietly at first and then simply as a matter of fact. The Mercer Library. Which embarrassed Eliza and which Wade found privately satisfying, though he never said so. The first people to use it regularly were children, ranching families' kids who had an hour free on a Saturday morning and nowhere particular to be. Then their mothers, who came to return the children and stayed to look at the shelves. Then a handful of men who came in the evenings with the faintly defiant look of people doing something they expected to be judged for, and found nobody judging them. By the end of that first year, there was a waiting list for the newer titles. Della Marsh had come by in September with what was apparently intended as a social visit but was clearly reconnaissance. She'd walked the reading room with the expression of someone recalibrating an opinion she'd held too long. At the door on her way out, she'd stopped and said to Eliza, "I heard you were from Philadelphia." A pause. I assumed that meant something different. "Most people do," Eliza had said pleasantly, and left it there. Tom Briggs brought his 2 daughters every other Saturday and stayed to read himself, which he would not have admitted to 6 months earlier and now didn't bother to hide. He sat at the center table with whatever was available and read with the focused pleasure of a man discovering a thing he'd been missing without knowing it. And once when Wade came to collect Eliza after a supply run and found Tom there, Tom looked up and said, without preamble, "I was wrong about her, you know, when I set all this up. I thought I was finding you something practical." "She is practical," Wade said. "She's more than that." Tom looked back at his book. "You know what I mean." "I do," Wade said. "Don't make a speech about it." Tom didn't make a speech. He turned his page and Wade waited by the door. And when Eliza came out of the back room with a box of books to shelve, he took the box from her and carried it himself, which he didn't need to do, and which she didn't argue about, and which was, in the small economy of their daily life together, a kind of language they'd both gotten fluent in. Met. Their first child, a son, arrived in the spring of 1881. They named him James, for no particular reason except that both of them liked the sound of it, and it suited him when he came. A serious baby with dark eyes and a habit of looking at things longer than most infants bothered to, which Eliza said was curiosity and Wade said was suspicion, and which turned out to be both. The birth had not been easy. Eliza would tell you so herself, bluntly, to anyone who asked with the idealized tone of people who'd been absent from it. The doctor came from town, and the night was long, and Wade sat outside the bedroom door in the straight-back chair from the kitchen and did not move for 6 hours, which Pete and the Dees brothers observed from the bunkhouse, with the respectful silence of men who understood what they were looking at. When the doctor came out and said everyone was fine, Wade went in. Eliza was pale and exhausted, and she had James in the crook of her arm with the battered expression of someone who had just been through something serious and come out the other side. She looked at Wade when he came through the door, and she said, before he could say anything, "Don't make a face like that. We're both fine." "I'm not making a face." "You're making a face." He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at James, who looked back with those long, suspicious eyes. He was very small and not particularly beautiful the way people expected babies to be. He was red-faced and scrunched and appeared irritated by the whole situation, which Wade understood completely. "He looks like he's already annoyed," Wade said. "He gets that from you," Eliza said. He put his hand on her hair, gently, the way a man does something he hasn't practiced. She leaned her head slightly into it, which was her way. They sat like that for a while, the 3 of them in the lamplight, while outside the spring night turned slowly and the double M held its shape against the dark. A daughter came 2 years later, Clara. They used the name without discussion, which was its own kind of conversation. Wade had said it once, quietly, and Eliza had looked at him and nodded, and that was all. The second Clara was nothing like the stillness her name had carried for years. She arrived loud and opinionated and with a full head of dark hair, and she was walking at 10 months and had figured out how to open the reading room's back door latch at 18 months, which required a new latch and a conversation about the girl's engineering instincts that made Eliza laugh the real laugh, the sudden and undecorative one that Wade had spent years wanting to cause. James and Clara grew up on the double M the way ranch children did, knowing the work before they knew much else, understanding that the land had its demands and those demands did not move aside for inconvenience or preference. But they also grew up in that reading room, surrounded by books from 3 cities, in a space their mother had built out of a conviction that people out here didn't have to stay only what the land had made them. James grew into a boy who was quiet like his father and precise like his mother, who could run a fence line at 12 and read 3 years above his age, and who had a habit of asking why that Wade had to remind himself to answer rather than deflect. Clara was louder and faster and had no patience for things she found pointless, and at 7 she declared to Eliza that she wanted to be a doctor, to which Eliza had said simply, "Then you'll need to study harder than anyone expects you to." And Clara had taken that as a directive rather than a discouragement, which was exactly how it had been intended. They were imperfect children, which is to say they were real ones. James lied about small things and had to be caught and didn't do it again. Clara broke 3 of the reading room windows with a ball at various points in her childhood and paid for the replacements out of her own saved earnings, which Eliza enforced with more relish than the situation strictly required. They fought with each other with the focused creativity of children who had no other children close enough to fight with, and made up with the same focused creativity and grew up knowing each other in the specific, irrevocable way of people who have no choice but to. The reading room grew in the way that things grow when someone with resources and direction is behind them. By 1885, it had 2 rooms. By 1888, it had 3, with the third dedicated to a rotating stock of newspapers from 6 cities that Eliza maintained through subscriptions, and which became, in that isolated stretch of West Texas, a window onto a world that most people out there had been told was too far away to matter. A woman named Rosa Menendez started teaching reading lessons there on Wednesday afternoons, first to children, then to a group of Mexican ranch workers from 2 neighboring properties who came in the evenings, hats in hand, expecting to be turned away and finding instead a table, chairs, and Eliza Mercer sitting across from them asking what they wanted to learn. Rosa stayed for 12 years. She was paid fairly, which was not the standard in Harlan's Crossing, and which Eliza enforced without apology. The community shifted around them, the way communities do when something changes at the center. Not dramatically, not in ways people could point to cleanly, but families who'd been on the edge of leaving stayed. Children who might have grown up assuming the world stopped at the county line grew up knowing it didn't. The library became, in the slow, unremarkable way of genuine things, part of what the place was. Wade watched it happen with the patience of a man who had learned that growth, like grass on hard land, didn't announce itself. He ran the ranch. He expanded the herd to what it should have always been. He hired fairly and paid fairly and had the reputation of a man you could deal straight with, which in that part of the country at that time was the most valuable reputation available. He was not beloved in the way some men were beloved. He was respected, which suited him better and meant more. He and Eliza argued sometimes. That is worth saying plainly, because the story of 2 difficult people learning to live together has no honest version that omits it. They argued about money, not its absence now, but its use, the decisions it enabled, the questions it raised about what they owed the community and what they owed themselves. They argued about the children, about the balance between the ranch's demands and the education Eliza was determined they'd have. They argued twice about Tom Briggs, who had a habit of involving himself in Wade's business decisions with a familiarity that was meant well and was occasionally maddening. The arguments were real and sometimes ugly at the edges because they were both people who had learned not to give ground easily and who had strong opinions about things that mattered. But they were also short because neither of them was interested in prolonging a fight past the point of its usefulness. They'd say what needed saying, sometimes too hard, and then they'd sit with it and come back to each other. And the coming back was always more true than the fight had been. That was the thing nobody talked about when they talked about the Mercers in later years. They talked about the library. They talked about the land and the cattle and the fair wages and Rosa Menendez's reading lessons. They talked about the expansion of the Double M and the scholarship money Eliza quietly arranged for 2 young people from the area to attend schools back east. What they didn't talk about, because they hadn't seen it, was the ordinary work of 2 people who were not natural at closeness choosing it anyway. Again and again, in the 10,000 small ways a life is made. In the winter of 1891, Wade got sick. It came on quietly the way bad things sometimes did. A cough that didn't clear, a tiredness that sat beneath the surface of the days. By December, he'd lost weight he couldn't afford to lose, and the doctor from Harlan's Crossing came out and used words that Eliza listened to with the focused, terrible calm she brought to things she could not fix by working harder. He spent 3 weeks in bed, which was the most miserable experience of his adult life, and which he communicated clearly and frequently to anyone within earshot. Eliza managed the ranch alongside Cal Dees, who had become foreman by that point, and who ran things with a competence that Wade had to admit privately was a relief. She sat with him in the evening, same as always, at the bedside now rather than the kitchen table, and she did not reassure him with things she didn't know to be true, which he was grateful for, because he had no patience for false comfort, and she had long since stopped offering it. "You're going to drive everyone insane until you're back on your feet," she said one evening, in approximately the 3rd week. I'm already insane, he said. This is what I'm normally like. You just didn't know because I was busy. I knew, she said. I've always known. He looked at her. She was sitting in the chair beside the bed with a book face down in her lap, and the reading room's lamp on the table beside her, the one she'd brought from the East Corner building because it was better than the house lamp, a fact she mentioned every time she brought it over, which was often. She looked tired. Not the exhausted tired of the early years, but the tired of someone managing more than one large thing at once. You didn't sign up for a sick husband, he said. I didn't sign up for a well one either, she said. I signed up for this specific one. Sick and well are part of the same agreement. He was quiet for a moment. I meant it as an apology. I know you did. She picked up her book. Stop apologizing and get better. That's the more useful activity. He got better, slowly, in the aggravating incremental way of a body recovering from something it would carry marks of for a long time afterward. By February, he was back on his feet, thinner and slower than before, and the slowness never entirely left. He moved through his days with the particular care of a man who had been reminded that his body had its own opinions about his plans. He adjusted. He hated adjusting. He adjusted anyway. James took on more of the ranch work that year, at 17, with a seriousness that made Wade ache in ways that were not entirely bad. The boy worked beside Chaldees and asked questions and made mistakes, and didn't make the same mistake twice, which was all Wade had ever asked of any hand he'd employed. Watching his son on the land that had almost been taken, on the land that a woman's quiet decision and a trust document and a long ride to Abilene had saved, there was something in that which didn't have clean language, but which sat in Wade's chest on the good days like something earned. The year they'd both turned 50, which fell in 1888 for Wade and 1889 for Eliza, there was a gathering at the Double M that Tom Briggs had organized without asking permission, which was characteristic of Tom. It was not a party. Wade had been clear on that point, and Tom had agreed and then invited 40 people anyway, which was Tom's version of a compromise. People came from across the county. Ranch families, the Menendez family, 3 of Rosa's former students who were now grown, Caldwell, the postmaster who was 80 and had apparently decided that the Mercers were worth the ride, Hector Reyes, the blacksmith, who had watched Wade stand outside the post office on that July day in 1879 and had kept his questions to himself then and for every year since. They ate outside in the October air, long tables borrowed from 3 neighboring properties, the food made by Eliza and Rosa and 2 of the Dees women with the particular collaborative efficiency of people who'd been doing things together long enough to not need instructions. James served, and Clara, at 6, appointed herself the person who made sure nobody's cup was empty, a role she performed with the focused intensity she brought to everything. Someone, Wade never found out who, had made a small sign and hung it on the reading room door. It said, in plain painted letters, for everyone. He saw it late in the evening, when most people had gone and the tables were being cleared and the night air had gotten cold enough for coats. He stood in front of it for a moment. Eliza came and stood beside him. "Did you do that?" he said. "No." "Do you know who did?" "No." She looked at it. "But they got it right." He looked at the sign and then at the building behind it. 3 rooms now of books and newspapers and reading lessons and a stove that was kept burning on winter afternoons and a table where Rosa's students sat on Wednesday evenings learning to read in their second language, and further back, in the dark, the land that had almost gone and hadn't, and the house that had been too quiet and wasn't anymore, and the life that had started as a transaction between a lonely man and a woman with a secret, and had become, by the slow accumulation of ordinary days and difficult truths and decisions made in cold kitchens and lamplight, something else entirely. "It's a good sign," he said. "It is," she agreed. They stood there for a moment, which was the closest either of them ever got to sentimentality about it. There is a thing that happens sometimes in a life where you arrive at a moment and realize that every bad decision, every loss, every compromise and failure and thing you'd rather not have been true, all of it was necessary for the specific destination you're standing in. Not because suffering is noble or loss is secretly good, because it isn't, but because people are not built in the easy weather, they're built in the hard kind. And the people who come through the hard weather intact, not undamaged but intact, are usually the ones who found someone to stand with them while it came down. That is what the Mercers were. Two people who were, separately, harder than they appeared and lonelier than they showed and caring more than they'd told anyone, who came together out of practical necessity and stayed together out of something more stubborn and more true, who built a ranch and a family and a reading room in the middle of difficult country and left a mark on that place that lasted past both of them. It is worth saying, though, because the story is easy to misread, the money was not nothing. Eliza's trust saved the Double M. That is a fact. But the trust had been there for years before she arrived, doing nothing useful, sitting in a Philadelphia bank while a woman spent 18 months trying to outrun the weight of it. What changed when she came west was not the amount, it was the purpose. The trust became useful the moment she decided to use it for something she actually believed in, rather than as armor against a world that had always measured her in dollars. That is the part people got wrong in later years when the story of the Mercer Library became a thing people told. They said a rich woman came to Texas and used her money to build something good, and that is true but incomplete. The more honest version is, a woman who had everything except what she needed most came to a failing ranch in the middle of nowhere and found a man who looked at her and saw a person. Not a fortune, not a problem, not an asset or an obligation. A person. And she built things here because this was where she felt seen, and everything she built was an extension of that one true conviction, that people should be seen before they are measured, that you look at the human being first, and the balance sheet, if it ever matters at all, comes later. Wade Mercer, for his part, would have said it differently and said less of it. He was not a man for principles articulated out loud, but if you'd asked him, in his later years, sitting on the porch of the house they'd repaired and expanded and painted twice over the decades, what he thought the whole of it meant, he would have been quiet for a moment, and then he would have said something like, "I was wrong about what I needed. I thought I needed simple. Turned out I needed true." And that was enough of a lesson for one life. James Mercer took over the Double M in 1905 and ran it for 30 years, expanding it again, managing it through droughts and economic disasters, and a war, and the slow changing of a century. He was a fair man and a careful one, and he spoke about his mother's reading room with the specific pride of someone who had grown up understanding that a place like that was not an accident. Clara Mercer became a doctor, as she'd said she would at age 7. She trained in St. Louis, came back to the Texas Panhandle, and ran a small practice for 40 years. She was demanding of her patients and impatient with self-pity and absolutely without condescension, which were qualities she'd absorbed from 2 different directions. She named her daughter Eliza, which made her mother cry, the only time James ever saw his mother cry, a fact he mentioned at the funeral and which made everyone in attendance understand without further explanation exactly who Eliza Mercer had been. The reading room became a proper library by 1910, with a county charter and a modest annual budget and a hired librarian. It stood for decades. The sign that someone anonymous had painted, for everyone, was repainted twice, but the words stayed the same, because there was no improving on them. Wade Mercer died in the spring of 1912, on a morning in April when the land was greening at the edges and the creek was running higher than usual from the winter rains. He died in his own bed, in the house that had held against the wind for 33 years, with Eliza beside him and James in the doorway, and the whole ranch going about its morning work outside the window. He had been 74 years old and had spent 33 of those years in a life he had not seen coming and would not have traded. He was buried on the Double M, on the low ground near the creek where the grass was thick and the cottonwoods grew, which was the place he'd always liked best without ever saying so, and which Eliza had known without needing to be told. Eliza Mercer lived for another 11 years, running the reading room and the library fund, and corresponding with books dealers in 4 cities, and watching her grandchildren grow up in the place she had chosen, deliberately, out of all the places she could have gone. She was not easy in her old age. She was the same as she had always been, direct and unsentimental, and convinced that most problems had practical solutions if you were willing to look at them clearly. The staff at the library called her Mrs. Mercer, with a respect that had nothing to do with the endowment and everything to do with the woman herself. She died in 1923, at 68, on a winter morning, in the house that had been her home for 44 years. James and Clara were both there. There was no grand speech at the end, no final summation. She had said what she'd needed to say, over the years, to the people who mattered, in the plain and undecorated language that was the only kind she'd ever trusted. What remained was the land and the library and two children who had been raised to look at people before they looked at anything else. That was not nothing. In fact, in the long and difficult accounting of a life, that was almost everything.